What the hell is that?
Oh no, it's the Japanese!
Fuck you, Dolphin! Fuck you, Dolphin!
Viewer discretion is advised.
Miami Dolphins. You wasted Dan Marino's entire career, and this is how you ended it, in a blowout loss to the Jags. The Jags. This play. Don Shula on the sideline and a rascal scooter. You're kidding me? What is it? Miami Dolphins, Stephen M. Ross. Stephen Ross is also a billionaire real estate developer that started out focusing on affordable housing and now has graduated to gentrifying previously rundown areas of cities. He bought the Dolphins from the late Wayne Huizenga in 2008. Since then, he has lobbied the city to pay for renovations to Sun Life Stadium, though I doubt they fall for that kind of bullshit again. The Monday Night Miracle. Down 23 points in the fourth quarter, the Jets, led by Vinny Testaverde, rallied to tie the game at 30. The Dolphins took the lead again, but before regulation ended, offensive lineman Jumbo Elliott caught a TD, and the Jets won it in overtime. Arnold Schwarzenegger said of the game, "I think the Dolphins have to be terminated." Few cheating scandals have serious repercussions off the field. During his tenure as coach, Don Shula had policies in place to inject his players with painkillers and get them out on the field with no regard for their safety. Shula was named in a 2015 lawsuit that contends he had a decades-long scheme to put hurt players at risk for further injury. Kawhi and D. Rose approved. Originally opened in 1987, this arena has probably had the most names. Joe Robbie Stadium, Pro Player Park, Pro Player Stadium, Dolphin Stadium, Dolphin Singular Stadium, Sun Life Stadium, and my personal favorite, Land Shark Stadium.
Land Shark.
Oh, Walter.
To me, this park seems very old, even though it's been open only 31 years, and privately funded renovations were completed in 2015. It's probably due for a name change soon.
So, next year, I'm buying.
Dan Marino should die of gonorrhea and rot in hell.
Many of you probably thought of this game first as a memorable ass whipping, as it was Dan Marino's send-off, and a despicable one too. The Dolphins actually beat the Seahawks in a playoff game the week before. I forgot the Seahawks were an AFC team once, but then ran into the buzzsaw that was the 14-2 Jags. Marino looked his age as he went 11 for 25 with 1 TD and 2 INTs. Fred Taylor blew the game open with a 90-yard run, and the Jags never looked back. I went to the dolphinshop.com and I was surprised to see that a Brock Osweiler jersey wasn't being promoted, but a Ryan Tannehill women's jersey was. These colors have pretty much stayed the same forever, that whole teal and orange thing. Honestly, I think it would be much cooler if they attached dorsal fins to the back of their uniform. Here are the incentives that were used to lure Jay Cutler out of retirement. Unlimited cigarettes, acceptance that zero will be given or taken, and $10 million. In news not surprising to anyone, the team finished 6-10 and Jay Cutler returned to his retirement where he belongs. An epic backfire. Not to be confused with Snowflake, the field goal kicking Dolphin. TD looks like a giant anthropomorphic wall-mounted fish. I can respect that the designers did not give TD any hands as he just slogs around the field with flippers. Kind of like Gronkowski trying to make a tackle. And let's get rid of the sun and replace it with a merry-go-round, because that's what they've been doing with a QB since Marino left. And give this Dolphin a halo, since all anyone has talked about in Miami has been one fluke play against the Patriots. Y'all didn't even make the playoffs. It was one game. Fins fans have been growing in salt over the years, especially since living in the shadow of your new stadium roof and the Pats. But hey, you got that miracle last year, so I guess that covers up the complete failure Ryan Tannehill was, or Jay Cutler. Are you gonna stand trial for murdering Ryan Tannehill? Keep holding on to 72 like it's relevant. You played less games against shit competition. Instead of bringing in better coaches, you brought in a team of mechanics to finally tune your tank. You're starting Fitception. And for those of you who come back in 3 months to tell me this didn't age well, I ain't worried. If the Jets passed on Marino, you wasted him. The original home of the Dolphins, the Orange Bowl served the NFL for 20 years. The stadium used to have an actual Dolphin tank in the 60s until Snowflake was kidnapped by Ray Finkel. After nearly 50 years of use, the stadium was demolished to make room for the publicly funded disaster that is Marlins Park. We're gonna start with a host of this year's Super Bowl, the only one Miami will see for a long time. During its first few times hosting, which is a total of 5, this stadium would be considered average, but just like it changed its name a million times, it's been transformed into a semi-roofed venue that has improved from its days as Landshark Stadium. This was the site of Joe Montana's epic fourth quarter comeback win versus the Bengals in 1989. The only venue to host back-to-back Super Bowls and 5 of the first 8, the Orange Bowl kicked off the era as a near-permanent site for the big game. But after Super Bowl 8 and Joe Robbie was built, it never hosted again. Site of the famous Super Bowl III, the Orange Bowl aged out and was demolished in 2008 to make way for Marlins Park. I'd say it was an average stadium at best.
After he last played in an NFL game, Dan Marino's name still commands respect and admiration. Marino spent 17 seasons with the Miami Dolphins, rewriting the record books and putting up numbers that are still, even by today's standards, phenomenal. Marino was a 9-time Pro Bowler and 3-time first-team All-Pro. He won over 61% of his regular season starts. He led the league in passing yards 5 times and touchdown passes 3 times. He led the Dolphins to the playoffs 10 times, and yet, as everybody knows, he never won a Super Bowl. How is it that a player so phenomenal, the most important position, never won a single Super Bowl? This video tries to explain why. Enjoy. Marino fell in the 1983 draft until the 27th pick, where the defending AFC champion Miami Dolphins and Hall of Fame coach Don Shula snatched him up. Marino began his rookie season on the bench behind incumbent starter David Woodley, but it took only 5 games before Marino became the starter in place of the ineffective Woodley. Marino would go on to have one of the best rookie seasons in NFL history, throwing for 20 touchdowns and 6 interceptions in just 9 starts. The Dolphins finished the year 12-4 thanks to a stout defense and Marino's precision passing. They got a first-round bye and played the Seattle Seahawks at home in the divisional round. In his first ever playoff game, Marino was solid, not spectacular, throwing 2 touchdowns but also 2 interceptions. However, he led Miami on a touchdown drive to take a 3-point lead with 4 minutes left. Then, bad luck struck. After his defense gave back the lead with a touchdown with 1:15 left, kick returner Fulton Walker fumbled the ball back to Seattle, setting them up with a field goal to make it a 27-20 game. Then Walker fumbled again on Seattle's next kickoff, ending the game for good. Miami committed 5 turnovers on the day, 2 interceptions from Marino, and 3 other fumbles. It sounds strange to say about a rookie quarterback, but 1983 was probably the most complete Dolphins team Marino ever had in terms of ground support and defensive support. In terms of missed opportunities in the Marino era, 1983 is way up there. If Dan Marino was ever going to win a ring, 1984 would have been the year. His 1984 season is legendary and without question a top 5 season ever by a quarterback. Marino led the league in every positive statistic you can think of, and he did so putting up numbers that even in 2020 are ridiculous. 5,084 yards and 48 touchdowns with a 108.9 passer rating. It wasn't just the individual success though. The Dolphins finished 14-2 and had the best offense in the league, scoring at least 28 points in 16 of 19 games. They earned the 1 seed in the AFC and destroyed both the Seahawks and Steelers in the divisional round and AFC championship game. Marino was particularly dominant in the AFC championship game against his hometown Steelers, who famously passed him up in the 1983 draft. He threw for 421 yards and 4 touchdowns in a 45-28 romp. Unfortunately for Marino, Marino and the Dolphins, their Super Bowl opponent would be the 15-1 juggernaut San Francisco 49ers, led on offense by future Hall of Fame coach Bill Walsh and future Hall of Fame quarterback Joe Montana, and on defense by future Hall of Famer Ronnie Lott, in addition to many other very good players. The game started out well for Marino and the Dolphins, taking a 10-7 lead after one quarter, but then the roof caved in. The 49ers' well-oiled machine dominated from that point on, particularly in the second quarter, scoring 21 unanswered to take a commanding 28-10 lead before the Dolphins added 2 field goals to go into halftime down 28-16. The second half was more of the same, with the 49ers getting constant pressure on Marino, sacking him 4 times while the Dolphins defense was unable to slow down the dinking and dunking 49ers offense. The final score was 38-16 49ers. Montana won Super Bowl MVP after putting up 331 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions through the air, and 59 yards and 1 touchdown on the ground. The 49ers also controlled the clock, having the ball for 37 minutes compared to just 23 for Miami. Marino's final stat line was not very good, 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions with a 66.9 passer rating, but as what would be the case for most of his career, a lot of his playoff interceptions came when his team was already down a ton and he was trying to force throws. This would end up being the only Super Bowl appearance of Marino's illustrious career, and unlike fellow one-and-done Super Bowl quarterbacks Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees, he was unable to cash in on his lone opportunity. Dan Marino was once again named first-team All-Pro in 1985 after throwing for 4,137 yards and 30 touchdowns, both leading the league, and he's famously the only quarterback to defeat the vaunted 1985 Chicago Bears. Marino took a noticeable step back statistically from his legendary 1984 season, but the Dolphins' offense was still potent, finishing 4th in points per game and finishing with a 12-4 record to earn another first-round bye. By this point, however, the defense was starting to see signs of slippage, going from 1st in points per game allowed in Marino's rookie year to 7th in 1984 to 12th in 1985. Still, everybody expected Miami to return to the Super Bowl, especially after Marino led a furious 18-point second-half comeback in a 24-21 win against the Cleveland Browns in the divisional round. The Dolphins' AFC Championship game opponent would be the wild-card New England Patriots, who had already given Miami 2 difficult showdowns in the regular season. Despite this, everybody was expecting a rematch of Miami-Chicago in Super Bowl 20, but instead they got a New England blowout. The Patriots ended up shocking the Dolphins in the Orange Bowl by a score of 31-14. The Dolphins committed a season-high 6 turnovers, giving the Patriots pristine field position all game long. Much like the 49ers the year before, the Patriots dominated the time of possession 40 minutes to 20 and also racked up 255 yards on the ground. Marino had a subpar day, throwing 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions on 48 attempts, most of which once again came when his team was down big, while his teammates committed 4 fumbles to shut down any chance the team had of closing the gap on the scoreboard. It was a total team failure, and Marino is not absolved of blame, but as it turns out, this would be the last time for a while the Dolphins would get anywhere near this far again. 1986 saw Marino get named first-team All-Pro for the 3rd straight year. He had another ridiculous season, throwing for 4,746 yards and 44 touchdowns, although he did add 23 interceptions. Still, the Dolphins finished 1st in points per game, but finished just 8-8 and missed the playoffs due to their porous defense, which finished 26th out of 28 teams in points per game allowed. The defense allowed 50 points twice and 30-plus points in 7 of 16 games. The team still might have been able to get a wild card spot if not for a brutal 51-45 overtime loss to the Jets early in the year and a 34-27 loss in the last week of the season to the Patriots, where they blew 7-point fourth-quarter leads in both games. Marino had several bad performances and losses, but his offense was the only thing keeping the Dolphins above water. No pun intended. The strike-shortened 1987 season saw Marino continue his excellent play, when he actually played, that is. The Dolphins finished the season 8-7, but that includes 3 strike games with scabs. In Marino's 12 starts, he went 7-5 and had a 16-game pace of 4,327 yards and 35 touchdowns. The offense was still great as they finished 7th in points per game, while the defense was once again below average, finishing 16th in points per game allowed. The Dolphins barely missed the playoffs for several reasons. They blew huge leads in the season-opening road loss to New England 21-7 and a 21-0 lead in a home 34-31 overtime loss to Buffalo, and threw up a clunker in a de facto playoff game in the last week of the season, a 24-10 home loss to New New England. Much like with Drew Brees, it's difficult to gauge how much blame Marino deserves since he was the only thing standing between the Dolphins being respectable and being a bottom feeder. The 1988 season was a mess for both Miami and Marino individually. Well, at least relatively in Marino's case. He led the NFL in passing yards with 4,434 and threw 28 touchdowns, but he also threw 23 interceptions, and the Dolphins' offense was below average, finishing 17th in points per game in addition to their shitty defense, 24th in points per game allowed. The team finished 6-10, but not your usual 6-10. There were several losses which totally fall on the defense, such as 44-30 and 38-34 losses to New York, and a 31-28 loss to Indianapolis. Yet there were also several losses where the Dolphins' offense completely failed to show up, such as a 15-13 loss to Indianapolis, a 9-6 loss to the Bills, and a 6-3 loss to the Patriots, which featured 3 missed field goals. It's notable to mention that the Dolphins' kickers finished the season with a putrid 52.2% on field goals, which was well below the league average of 71.7%. Also, by this time, the divisional rival Buffalo Bills were emerging as one of the NFL's elite, in large part due to their excellent drafting, while the Dolphins had regressed around Marino due to missing on high draft picks such as Lorenzo Hampton, John Bosa, Eric Kumaro, and their upcoming 1989 first-round pick, Sammy Smith. 1989 saw Miami miss the playoffs for the 4th straight season, finishing 8-8 after starting out a strong 7-4. Marino had his worst statistical season of his career to that point, falling just short of 4,000 yards and throwing 24 touchdowns to 22 interceptions with a 76.9 passer rating. The Dolphins' offense finished 15th in points per game and 22nd in points per game allowed. While Marino had his shortcomings, the Dolphins' disgustingly bad rushing attack was the bigger culprit for their inability to finish drives. The team averaged a league-worst 3.3 yards per carry, in addition to blowing a 7-point fourth-quarter lead in a 40-33 loss to the Jets and an 11-point fourth-quarter lead in a 27-24 loss to the Bills on opening weekend. Unlike 1988, however, there weren't any losses where the defense did its job, as in all 8 losses, the team gave up at least 26 points. Keep in mind, this was when the league average points per game was much lower than it is today at just 20.6. Marino, despite his worst ever season to this point, led 4 game-winning drives to keep the team's record from being even worse. Still, Marino's production had taken a noticeable dip for 2 straight years, and while he was still one of the league's best quarterbacks, he was no longer the wonderkind who was putting up GOAT-type numbers. 1990 saw the Dolphins finally return to the playoffs after a 4-year hiatus with a 12-4 record. This was in large part due to their defense improving dramatically to 4th in points per game allowed. The team's offense continued to be just okay, finishing 14th in points per game. Marino threw for quote-unquote just 3,563 yards and 21 touchdowns in 16 starts, but he also cut down big time on his interceptions, throwing just 11. The ground game, however, continued to be disgustingly bad, finishing 26th in yards per carry. Despite the Dolphins' great record, they failed to win their division, as the 13-3 Buffalo Bills earned the crown as well as a first-round bye. It should be noted that the Dolphins' 4 losses on the season came to very good teams: the eventual Super Bowl champion 13-3 New York Giants, the playoff-bound 10-6 Washington redacted, the aforementioned 13-3 eventual AFC champion Buffalo Bills, and eventual 12-4 AFC runner-up Los Angeles Raiders. After a thrilling 17-16 win over the Kansas City Chiefs in the wildcard round at home, which saw Marino throw 2 fourth-quarter touchdown passes to overcome a 16-3 fourth-quarter deficit, the Dolphins traveled to Buffalo for a divisional round showdown with their hated rivals. The Dolphins' elite defense completely shit its pants, giving up 44 points in a 44-34 season-ending loss. The Dolphins at one point in the fourth quarter made it a 30-27 game, but in the end, Jim Kelly threw for 339 yards and 3 touchdowns, while Thurman Thomas ran for 117 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Bills put up almost 500 yards of offense. Marino, for his part, fought valiantly, throwing for 323 yards, 3 touchdowns, and even running for another. But the Bills and their famed K-gun offense were just too much. Even though the 90s Bills have become a meme today for losing 4 straight Super Bowls, they were an absolutely dominant team in the class of the AFC during Marino's prime years, which is an extremely overlooked aspect of his lack of Super Bowl rings/chances. The 1991 season saw Marino earn another Pro Bowl berth due to his 3,970 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 85.8 passer rating. rating, all elite numbers in those days. He also threw just 13 interceptions. The Dolphins offense finished 6th in points per game, but was once again held back by a shitty defense that finished 24th in points per game allowed. Overall, the team finished 8-8 and missed the playoffs for the 5th time in 6 years. The running game continued to be the biggest Achilles heel for Miami, both offensively and defensively. They finished just 21st in yards per carry on offense and were a league worst defensively in yards per carry allowed. Despite this, the team blew fourth quarter leads in half of their 8 losses. A 24-21 lead to the Bills in Week 1, a 13-10 lead in Week 8 versus Houston, which saw aforementioned draft bust Sammy Smith brutally fumble on the opponent 1-yard line late with a chance to win the game, a 23-10 lead to the lowly Chargers in Week 16, and a 2017 lead to the New York Jets in Week 17, which saw a go-ahead touchdown drive led by Marino with 45 seconds left get wasted. This team easily and probably should have been in the playoffs with a 9-7 or 10-6 record, but the defense continued to collapse at the worst possible times. Marino was no longer a young pup at this point, and the clock was beginning to tick ever so slightly. 1992 saw Miami return to the playoffs after finishing 11-5. Marino was once again named to the Pro Bowl after leading the league in passing yards and throwing for 24 touchdowns. For what it's worth, he also led the league with 6 game-winning drives. Miami's offense finished 8th in points per game, and the defense finished 11th in points per game allowed, although the ground game continued to be porous for Miami. Winning the AFC East and getting a first-round bye was huge, as was the team dismantling San Diego in the divisional round 31-0 to set up a home AFC Championship game with those pesky Buffalo Bills. The Bills were back in the AFC Championship game despite having to start backup quarterback Frank Reich the previous 2 weeks, which included the infamous 32-point comeback against Houston. Both teams were sloppy early on as the first quarter ended in a 3-3 stalemate. Buffalo then started to pull away, putting up 23 unanswered points to take a 26-3 lead at one point in the fourth quarter before Miami added a garbage time touchdown pass from Marino and another Buffalo field goal to reach the final score, a 29-10 win for Buffalo. The Dolphins committed 5 turnovers, 2 of which were interceptions from Marino and 3 of which were fumbles, including one on a kickoff to start the second half. Marino's final numbers were bad, throwing 2 interceptions and a 56.5 passer rating, although he had multiple incredible deep passes dropped that could have made this a much different game. He was also sacked 4 times by Buffalo's elite defensive line, and his running game was, unsurprisingly, non-existent. Much like their last AFC Championship game lost to New England in 1985, this was a total team failure for Miami, and it would end up being the closest Marino ever got to going back to a Super Bowl. Through just over 4 games, 1993 looked like it could be Marino's best season since 1987. Unfortunately for Marino and the Dolphins, he sustained a torn Achilles in their 5th game versus Cleveland. Marino was never mobile in the first place, but this injury would make him even more of a statue moving forward. The Dolphins went 4-1 in Marino's 5 starts and even started the season at 9-2 before losing their last 5 games to finish 9-7 and miss the playoffs. 1994 would end up being Dan Marino's last great statistical season in terms of volume, as he threw for almost 4,500 yards and 30 touchdowns to lead the Dolphins to a 10-6 record and AFC East title. The team's offense was elite, finishing 3rd, while the defense was, you guessed it, below average, finishing 17th in points per game allowed. There was plenty of blame to go around for the Dolphins only, quote-unquote, winning 10 games. The defense deserves the blame for a 42-31 loss to Buffalo and 38-35 loss to Minnesota, while Marino's offense deserves more of the blame for several close losses, such as a 17-14 loss to Chicago, which saw a blocked 45-yard field goal as time expired, a 16-13 overtime loss to Pittsburgh, and a 10-6 loss to Indianapolis, where the offense had 1st and goal at the 2-yard line late in the fourth quarter, but couldn't punch it in. Still, the team and Marino extracted some revenge for Super Bowl 19 against Joe Montana and Kansas City in the wild card round in a 27-17 win. They would then go on the road to face the eventual AFC champion San Diego Chargers in what would be one of the biggest heartbreaking losses in the Marino era. Marino came out on fire in the first half, throwing 3 touchdown passes to take a 21-6 lead going into halftime. But the second half was when the wheels fell off. The Dolphins gave up a safety on a run play to make it 21-8 and then allowed a 24-yard touchdown run to make it 21-15. The offense is stalled until San Diego Diego took a 22-21 lead off of a touchdown with 35 seconds left. Marino then led a drive that set up the team with a 48-yard field goal attempt to win the game, but kicker Pete Stoyanovich missed it. San Diego controlled the ball for almost the entire third quarter, and several dumb Miami penalties halted their next two drives before Marino's last drive, which ended with the missed field goal. It's tough to blame Marino for this loss. Not every quarterback is fortunate enough to have a kicker make their clutch 48-yard field goals in the playoffs. The Dolphins made the playoffs in 1995, although they underachieved with just a 9-7 record. Marino missed 2 games but was named to the Pro Bowl for the 9th and final time of his historic career. He was on a 16-game pace for almost 4,200 yards and 27 touchdowns. The offense finished 7th while the defense finished 10th. Pretty good balance, which makes the 9-7 record more disappointing. Miami lost the 2 games Marino sat out by a combined 4 points, but they also had several close losses with Marino, including a loss to Indianapolis where good old Pete Stoyanovich missed a game-winning 49-yard field goal attempt as time expired. Marino did lead several clutch drives to win close games against Atlanta and Cincinnati, however, and barely squeak into the playoffs where they would once again get to face their old nemesis Buffalo in the wild card round. Buffalo at this point wasn't the same powerhouse as they were in the early 90s, but they were still formidable. They scored on 4 of their first 5 drives to take a 24-0 lead, while the Dolphins wouldn't put points on the board until the 4th quarter when the game was already out of reach. The final score of 37-22 makes the game seem much closer than it actually was, as most of Miami's yards and all of their points came in garbage time during the 4th quarter. Buffalo racked up 536 yards, including 341 on the ground. Marino threw for over 400 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he also had 3 interceptions and couldn't get the offense going earlier. Still, when your defense gives up 37 points and 536 yards, it's not all his fault. This was another team failure by Miami in what would end up being the last game in Don Shula's legendary career. 1996 was the beginning of the Jimmy Johnson era in Miami, and it would be tumultuous as he and Marino would repeatedly clash over how to handle the offense. Marino would end up missing effectively 4 games in 1996, which the Dolphins went 1-3 in. Overall, the team went 8-8 and missed the playoffs. They were 13th in points per game and 17th in points per game allowed, a truly mediocre team across the board. Marino's numbers and efficiency were still excellent, but at 35 years old, he wasn't capable of taking over games the way he used to, and the team's offense completely no-showed in back-to-back 17-7 losses to Oakland and the New York Giants late in the year to end any hope the team had at making the playoffs. 1997 was similar to 1996. The Dolphins were a pretty mediocre team across the board, but unlike the previous year, they finished 9-7 and made the playoffs as a wild card. Marino started all 16 games and led the league in pass attempts, but threw for just 16 touchdowns and had to leave 2 games early due to injury. Both games Miami lost, including an inexcusable 9-6 loss to Buffalo. The season also saw the team blow a 15-point 4th quarter lead and a 36-33 overtime loss to Chicago and a 2-point loss to New England. Still, Marino led 3 game-winning drives, and his efficiency on a per drop-back basis was well above average. He looked like he still had enough left in the tank for another Super Bowl run until the playoffs. In the wildcard round against the Patriots, Marino completely shit his pants, completing just 39.5% of his passes, throwing 2 interceptions, one of which was returned for a pick 6, and getting sacked 4 times. He had a passer rating of just 29.2, and the team only mustered 3 points in a brutal 17-3 loss. The Dolphins' defense did its part, holding New England's offense to just 10 points. This is one of the few times the blame falls squarely on Marino's shoulders, and he had no excuse. The 1998 Dolphins finished 10-6 and made the playoffs again, and in a bit of a role reversal, it was largely thanks to their elite defense and not their Hall of Fame quarterback. The defense finished first in points allowed per drive, while the offense was a disappointing 20th in points per drive. Marino had nice counting stats, throwing for almost 3,500 yards and 23 touchdowns, but he averaged a career-worst 6.5 yards per attempt and was average in terms of efficiency metrics. The team also struggled to finish off games, blowing a 24-14 lead versus Buffalo, a 23-19 lead versus New England, and a 21-14 lead versus Jacksonville, all in the 4th quarter to prevent them from finishing with a better record. Still, they earned a home playoff game in the wildcard round versus the Buffalo Bills. This was the 4th and final time Marino would face Buffalo in the playoffs, and he would finally narrowly defeat them, rallying the troops to a 24-17 win to earn a divisional round matchup versus the absolutely loaded Denver Broncos, the defending Super Bowl champions and also soon-to-be repeat champs. The game followed the same script as most of Marino's playoff losses. The opponent jumped out to a huge lead early while the Dolphins' offense struggled. Due to the large deficit, Marino was forced to make risky throws, impacting his stats to make him look a little worse than he actually was. In this case, the Broncos scored touchdowns on their first 3 drives and ended up jumping out to a 21-3 halftime lead. The final score ended up being 38-3 after the Broncos capped off the game with a 79-yard fumble return touchdown. This was another team failure by Miami, as much like in 1990, their elite defense again collapsed come playoff time, giving up 424 yards, including 250 on the ground. Let's be real here. Denver was the better team, and even if Marino had played excellent, I'm not sure Miami would have won. Still, you would have liked to have seen Marino's offense generate more points. 1999 would end up being the last season in Dan Marino's historic career, and he was smart to hang it up, as it was obvious he had hit the proverbial cliff. In just 10 full games, he threw 12 touchdowns and 17 interceptions, and the team went just 4-6. The defense was once again very good, finishing 8th in points allowed per drive, while the offense remained mediocre. Still though, it's fitting that even a totally washed Marino ended up losing 2 games where he led his offense to 34 points and 31 points, as he did in a 37-34 loss to Indy and 38-31 loss to the Jets. Based on his play, Marino didn't deserve to make the playoffs, but perhaps as an act of mercy from the football gods, the team went 5-1 without him to give him one last chance at a Super Bowl. Against Seattle in the wildcard round, Marino showed he still had some magic left, as he led an 85-yard go-ahead touchdown drive in the fourth quarter to barely squeak by with a 20-17 win. But based on what happened the following week versus Jacksonville in the divisional round, perhaps Marino would have been better off going out in a close loss. It's hard to really put into words how badly the Dolphins got destroyed by the Jaguars in Marino's last game. The final score of 62-7 is bad, but even then it might not do it enough justice. Marino was terrible, and the only thing preventing his stat line from being even worse was a useless touchdown pass right before the end of the first half. Marino played the first half plus 1 drive in the third before the plug was finally pulled. The Dolphins in total had 19 possessions and scored just 7 points. The defense gave up 277 yards and 3 touchdowns in the air, as well as 257 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. The special teams even gave up a blocked punt. It was most likely the biggest collapse by any team in modern NFL history. It's also a shame such a brilliant player like Marino went out on the receiving end of what is the football equivalent of a Brazzers scene. So, to review, why didn't Dan Marino win any Super Bowls? Much like with other great quarterbacks who didn't win as many rings as you'd expect, the defense played a major factor. His best defenses statistically came both at the beginning of his career and at the very end of his career when he wasn't close to what he was in his prime. He had a below-average defense in 9 of his 17 seasons as a starter. He had a bottom 10 defense 4 times and a bottom 5 defense 3 times. On average, his defenses finished a very mediocre 14th in points per game allowed. Another factor was the consistently awful ground support he had virtually his entire career, and he played in an era where the ground game was much more vital than it is nowadays. Only 3 times in 16 years did Marino have a top 10 ground game in terms of yards per carry. 12 times he had a below average ground game, and in 11 of his 16 seasons, the team finished 20th or worse in yards per carry. Overall, his running support finished, on average, 21st in yards per carry throughout his career. Then we have the Buffalo Bills factor. As I mentioned before, having a divisional rival emerge as a title contender for the better part of a decade, 1988 to 1993, that coincided with Marino's physical prime years, absolutely has an impact on Super Bowl chances, most notably due to either not winning the division, having to play an extra playoff game, or missing the playoffs entirely because of 1 or 2 more losses against said title contender. What is interesting about Marino, however, is the lack of close playoff losses. Of his 10 career playoff losses, only 1983 versus Seattle and 1994 versus San Diego were 1-score games. His average playoff loss was by 19.5 points. This means many team failures, but one of the biggest trends in Marino's playoff losses were the offense starting slowly, as the Dolphins scored just 23 points total in the first quarter of their 10 playoff losses with Marino. That equates to just 2.3 points per quarter, which over the course of a full game is just 9.2 points per game. It's impossible to say exactly how much blame Marino deserves for these slow starts, but he obviously deserves some of the blame. In the few times Marino was in a close playoff game, he was very good in the fourth quarter, which is ironic considering what happens late in a close game is what people normally judge a QB's clutchness on. The biggest missed opportunities in Marino's career are 1983, 1984, 1985, 1992, and 1994. But even if Marino had made more Super Bowls, I doubt he would have been favored to win any of them. In 1983, he would have had to go against the 14-2 historically great offense of the Washington Redacted. In 1984, he faced the historically dominant 15-1 49ers and got crushed. In 1985, he would have faced the legendary Bears defense again, which is obviously not easy to defeat 2 times in one season. In 1992 and 1994, he would have had to face historically dominant and more well-rounded Cowboys and 49ers teams. Of those 5 years, I give him the best chance to win in 1983, his rookie year, due to the fact that Washington team shitting its pants in the actual 1983 Super Bowl against the Raiders. Unfortunately, we'll never know. Regardless, Marino was certainly good enough to win multiple Super Bowls if he had been blessed with better support on defense and on the ground. I don't think he is the best quarterback ever due to his lack of mobility and somewhat disappointing production after 1987, but he's probably the most fun quarterback to watch ever due to his extremely arrogant style of play and ability to make tight window throws with regularity.
That beautiful tank footage. The tank is a symbol of immense power. One firing of that cannon can make its mark on anything. You say you can't see it, why, it's in front of you. The Miami Dolphins. There is no hiding what they are trying to accomplish. They are tanking. Blatantly so. Not much needs to be explained on that front. You'd expect me to laugh at them for it, but I have no qualms with Miami tanking. They should have been doing this years ago. The issue with this endeavor is that they are more than likely going to fail, for a variety of reasons. Let's dig on this a bit. A tank in the NFL. It's not as easy as you would think. When you ponder such an endeavor, one team comes to mind immediately. The Philadelphia 76ers. The goal of the process was to strip everything down to the core in order to build a championship team for years to come. You will point to their success in becoming a playoff contender over this time, championship glory still to be determined. Here's my issue with that comparison. In the NBA, you only need 2 or 3 quality players to make yourself into a formidable team. In football, you need 22, at minimum. The NFL is full of so many more moving parts that require constant attention. This requires more intricate tactics and a cohesive team structure. Having one position as a glaring weakness may be the line between victory and defeat. That's not even getting into the increased risk of injury due to the contact nature of the sport. You could have everything lined up perfectly and then poof, here's a devastating injury to a key player that ends your season. It's not to say that a tank can't be done in this league. There is one notable instance where blatantly tanking has led to a dynasty. The Dallas Cowboys. Take yourself back to the late 1980s. A less glossy-eyed Jerry Jones decided to force his own stamp on this downtrodden team. The Cowboys have been through years of decline since their 70s heyday, and the time was now for a complete blow-up. A lot of unpopular moves were made. The fervor when firing the legendary Tom Landry had people fuming across the nation. They dismantled nearly everything, culminating in the infamous Herschel Walker trade. They got a bunch of players back in the deal, but they never played them. Dallas was thinking long-range game with the conditional picks. Even for the luck of that trade, there was significant wheeling and dealing with those returns as well. It took not only great negotiating skill, but a keen eye for talent. I don't have to go further on the results of what happened there. Nowadays, there wouldn't be a team so desperate as to trade everything for a running back, but Miami did have some pieces to trade off. The problem is this. For the quality haul of picks they got, what did they truly give up? There's a reason why Houston traded 2 first-rounders and a second for Laramie Tunsil. Premium blindside blockers don't grow on trees. It's incredibly high risk of Houston to do this, especially since the last time they traded top picks burned them considerably. But with how both Tunsil is playing and how he's seen as a leader, they may have gotten their left tackle for a decade. Even more questionable after the fact is Minkah Fitzpatrick. In Miami, he never got going since they kept jerking him around from position to position. Once he got to Pittsburgh, he emerged as a game changer overnight. Amazing what can happen when you keep talent where they feel the most comfortable playing. You also have to consider Minkah is a second-year pro, so there were 4 years of control left. Trading him for a first-round pick was seen as a good move at the time, but considering the Steelers' change in fortunes, it may not have been enough. Hell, even look at Ryan Tannehill. In Miami, he'd show flashes of potential, but could never realize it due to the team structure and injuries. Fast forward to Tennessee, and he's all but saved their season. He may even end up being a long-term option. It's gone so well for him. Kenyon Drake has looked a lot better since moving to Arizona. It just keeps going on and on. The problem with Miami has been the same thing for years. Structure. To be honest, they haven't had a consistently good coach since what, Dave Wanstead? Even then, he had significant flaws that held the team back. It's been a constant cycle of futility with mediocrity as its ceiling. Once in a while, they make the playoffs, be it due to an easy schedule or the deck breaking out in their favor. Their reward has always been getting their asses beaten into the ground by a real team. Thus is why their tanking should be embraced. The only thing is that players and coaches aren't fond of tanking. They want to perform to keep or gain a new job. Deliberately losing doesn't help their cause, so why should Brian Flores go along with it? He's come from New England, a culture of winning and championships. If they truly cared about tanking, why are they starting Ryan Fitzpatrick? He's a very serviceable quarterback that can carry even the shittiest of teams to 4 or 5 wins. Yes, unfortunately, the deliberate demolition of the Dolphins has been beaten by a team that isn't even trying to lose. The Cincinnati Bengals. They are merely awful just because they have a terrible team. Injured playmakers, no defensive stars, Andy Dalton reaching his end in that city that went trend chasing for a head coach. It was just like when you went 1-15 back in 2007. That's funny, I don't remember that being brought up with a tank. Might be because you drafted an offensive tackle that only played with you for 4 years. Today the Bungles will get Joe Burrow while you probably pray for Tua. And what's to say a franchise quarterback is going to save you? You had one, remember? Dan Marino? You wasted him by failing to support him for years on end. Some franchise savior when he gets a send-off that will live in infamy. But even with all of this, that isn't the main reason why I feel the Dolphins will probably fail at this endeavor. It's the cause of most of their failures over the past 20 years. You know damn well who I'm talking about here. Stephen Ross is a boob. He's a man who has absolutely no football savvy whatsoever, and he's either refused or is too dense to adapt to the league. He's why Adam Gase was allowed to run this team into the ground. He's a main reason why no one wants to play in Miami without shitloads of cash being thrown at them. Riddle me this. If you're going to begin a total rebuild, then why the hell are you letting the same GM that's been at the helm for 4 years run it? There's being hands-off, and then there's being so aloof that you have little idea of what the hell is even going on. It's been showing in the attendance. This has been happening for years, not just now with the Tank Brigade. Miami's main hurdle isn't going to be all of the pitfalls, but their owner himself. He doesn't know when to step in and guide his men in the right direction. It's laissez-faire economics at its worst. Remember, the greatest culture change comes at the top, and it seems like Ross doesn't want to change. The one thing that always stuck with me about Ross was that he was the only owner that voted against the moves of the Chargers and Raiders. His belief is that a franchise should be loyal to the city it represents. It should be a beacon of light that their city can cherish and respect. Sure, it's noble, but what the hell have you done to inspire the fans of Miami? You've thrown money around and brought in some celebrity owners. Good job. Sadly, money can't buy you knowledge of football, or else the Dolphins would be a dynasty again. The odds are against you, Miami. Good luck.